Hello, I'm Adam Southern, and this is Page by Page, a show dedicated to promoting literacy, authors, their works, and their words. And today I'm honored to have a New York Times best-selling author. He is the author of Widow of the South in a Separate Country and editor of A Guitar and a Pen, Mr. Robert Hicks. So really appreciate you being here with me today, Robert.
I'm honored to be here, Adam. It's great. You're doing a great job down here in Columbia, and it's always good to support Adam's World.
Well, thank you. When we started this show, I've put together a little list of a few people that if I had them on the show, I would really have accomplished something. Robert Hicks was at the top of the list, and I had John Meacham, Rick Bragg. So now I'm going to work on those two. I got Robert Hicks here finally. So thanks for being here.
I think you should raise your standards a little bit with me.
No.
And John Meacham and Rick Bragg are both amazing people. So I look forward to seeing those shows.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Widow of the South and what kind of drove you to write this book.
Well, for the last, actually we were looking at this, for the last 25 years, I was looking at how long it's been. I've been kind of the, unofficial, and I guess actually at one point official because they named me, the board named me that, but driving force behind the restoration and preservation of Carton Plantation. Originally just outside of Franklin, but as the world grows, in the middle of Franklin now. And when I went onto that board, literally was told by one of the older board members, I don't really care who lived here, I just want a pretty house. Well, the house, they're prettier houses. In fact, Columbia has some houses that are really much grander than Carton. But it did have something really unusual, and that is it had one of the largest private military cemeteries in America in the backyard. And so the question was, more than just the obvious answers, how did it happen? Who were these people? And so I spent some years trying to understand that. And then we carried on a really academic restoration of the house. The first time I saw the house, it was full of bales of hay. And so I had gone to my board and said, I'll raise the money if you will allow scholars to come in here. And so they approved that, and I went to places like Monticello and Mount Vernon and said, who's doing your furniture plan, who's doing your paint analysis, whatever it was. And so now we had completed what I think anywhere else would have been a $4 to $5 million restoration. We really had done it on the cheap over the years, borrowing and stealing, but it was academic. And we still had so few people coming to the site. And so my fear was that we were going to do all this and then no one was ever going to see it. So I thought, I could write a book. I say that in a sense that a theme of my family's history is being delusional. And so I thought that'll bring people. In a sense it has. I think that since the book came out, the few thousand people that were coming there, we'll have over 100,000 this year.
Wow.
So that really was the driving part of it. Now, the other side of it is I ended up going on Warner Books' longest book tour, and I really realized how delusional I was, and originally thinking I could write a book, because I got to meet in those, almost, close to 100 cities. I got to meet all those other delusional people that thought they could write a book that shouldn't be writing a book. And I realized there, for the grace of God, goes I. So, but at the same time, I think everyone should try. Everyone who believes they should write a book should at least try.
Well, Carrie McGavig, big character, central character of Widow of the South, the Civil War just came to her doorsteps. We think of the Civil War as kind of all that happened so long ago. Is the Civil War still important today?
Well, I think it is. In fact, last July 3rd, the New York Times had commissioned an op-ed from me on the 150th anniversary of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and that was the question, why the Civil War still matters. I think the Civil War is paramount to who we are as a people, and not just who we were, and not just who we are, but maybe who we will be as a people. It's that moment, and it's a long moment. It's not just those 4 years, it's the years before and the years afterwards, but it's that moment in history that gave meaning and value to all those platitudes of the Founding Fathers. It's really when we did stop being, Tennesseans and Ohioans and New Yorkers and Floridians, and we became Americans. It's the source of the American century. It's the source of the greatest generation. It's the reason why you and I are having this conversation in English and not in German. Because without the American Civil War, I think that there was little hope for this nation staying together. And so it's not just important if your family came over on the Mayflower, or if your ancestors fought in the Civil War. The truth is, the Civil War is the reason why your ancestors came afterwards. That all the people that came from Ireland or Southern Europe, or the people who are coming from Ecuador or Laos today, if they're throwing their lot with this country, it's really because of the American Civil War. So yes, I think that if there is one moment in American history that is of paramount importance, it is the American Civil War.
I agree. Being raised in the South, the war's always been very important to us as a people. But there may be a few people listening that really don't know what happened in Franklin on that November day in '64. Could you briefly summarize what took place there?
Briefly.
There's
I'll
no
try.
brief way.
I'll try. Well, what happens is let me just say this, Adam. When I moved to Franklin in 1974, the three things I knew about the Battle of Franklin were the most generals ever killed in a battle in any war in any continent. American generals were those killed at Franklin. There were 6. That it was the 5 bloodiest hours of the war. Well, we now know it really wasn't. There's an afternoon at Antietam that it is bloodier, but it's close. It's 5 of the bloodiest hours of the American Civil War. But the third thing we all knew, and everyone knew this, everyone in town knew this, all the new people knew this, was that it was totally inconsequential. And the reality is that as we understand it, this battle, which I'm about to tell you, was in fact really the last hurrah of the Confederacy. Arthur MacArthur, needless to say, a poorly named child, but the father of Douglas MacArthur, knew battles. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his service at Chattanooga. And so he wasn't a novice to it and just kind of overwhelmed, like, wow, this is powerful. But Arthur MacArthur said that, told Douglas that it was second only to Gettysburg in importance. So how does a battle that we've all been taught is totally inconsequential, a bloodbath of no meaning, become for Arthur MacArthur, and by the way, for many people at the time, one of the most important battles of the war? And the reality is, it's very late in the war. The big issue is whether Lincoln would be reelected president. Because you got to see the movie, but he doesn't. But he'll have Atlanta. And Atlanta will really seal the deal for his reelection. And so now, according to Margaret Mitchell, my fellow fiction writer, the war is over. I mean, she tells, Scarlett tells Rhett that. It's a lost cause. But Rhett tells her he likes lost causes, and by the way, he shows up in Franklin in the book. And so, but the reality is that what was at stake was continuing the war. And I think you can make a solid case, and I think what Arthur MacArthur was talking about was that this battle will, in fact, in reality, cut the war short 4 to 6 months. And at the rate of death we're having at that point, that's probably close to 100,000 more people. So what happens? After Atlanta, we all know what happens with Sherman. He makes his way to the sea, but what the world's watching, because Sherman has somewhat of a news block out until he gets to Savannah, what the world's really watching is these two armies. John Schofield, he will later discover Pearl Harbor, which is named after him, Schofield Barracks. John Schofield with the Union and trying to get to Nashville, and right behind him, John Bell Hood for the Confederacy, from Kentucky, recently from Texas. This chase will go on, and finally, just up here from Columbia, at Spring Hill, Hood will be able to get in front of Schofield and will cut him off, and he's going to have his battle. And I think that would normally have been the first day of the Battle of Spring Hill. The reality is that Schofield, realizing that so much is at stake, decides to virtually walk his troops through Hood's lines, gets to Franklin. Hood wakes up the next day on November 30th and finds the disaster of disasters. The already fortified small town of Franklin, Tennessee has now been refortified with like 25,000 troops and all the arms and materials that Schofield's carrying. Hood has to make a decision. The only reason that Schofield has stopped in Franklin is because the bridge is out. He has to rebuild that bridge to get to Nashville. And so Hood is trying to get his artillery, which he's left in Alabama, right in northern Alabama, his cannons, to the scene before Schofield is able to get out of town. And finally, Hood realizes it's not going to work. He has to hit him anyway. And so in what will become, I think, the last medieval battle fought in the Western world, a charge in open field, twice as long as Pickett's charge, twice as many men. A few years before, we've had the charge of the Light Brigade with 400, and now we have 20-something thousand boys running almost 2.5 miles and running to their death, and through these waves of assault by the Confederacy, and it almost works. As opposed to Lee at Gettysburg, Hood's troops do break through, but they can't hold it. And with that, 5 hours into the battle, the bridge built, Schofield leaves town, leaves his wounded, his dead, and just basically leaves town and gets to Nashville. And with that, really, any hope that the Confederacy had was lost. And so in the years afterwards, of course, Southerners tried to minimize the value of Franklin. It was part of the whole grand revision of history. There was no consequences to Franklin, but there were those voices like MacArthur, who said something really important, not so much happened here, but didn't happen here, didn't happen because of here. And I think that's the great story of what happened, and that's what Carrie McGavock and her family got caught up in as the only really operating field hospital at the time of the battle. Now the next day, every building in Franklin was a hospital. But through that battle, through the night, through the morning, it was their home that was the great center of it all.
And yeah, that battle was what created the Widow of the South. And Dolly Parton said something really interesting about Carrie McGavock. What was it that?
Some years ago, Dolly, in 2001, I think that's correct, used, or it may have been it may have been 2000. She used my cabin. I live in the hills west of Franklin, and she used my cabin for her little Sparrow album photography, and we started talking. We ended up going out there, and I told her the story, and we walked through the cemetery, and we went into the house, and we stood in front of that great portrait of Carrie McGavick, and I said, Dolly, you're the only person in Williamson County. She and her husband Carl have a house there. They'll have more obituaries when you die than she did. And she looked up at the portrait, and then she looked down at the carpet, and then she looked at me, and she said, yes, but I had to leave home to get them. And I think that's the real power of Carrie McGavick's story, is that she didn't leave home. That while she did at occasion go to New Orleans or go to Nashville, the reality is that she basically stayed planted, and she just remembered what had happened during those 5 hours in the days and weeks that followed, and then remembered all those boys that had been buried behind her house in that cemetery, an extension of her own family cemetery.
Now, the very pivotal John Bell Hood, who is the mastermind behind the Battle of Franklin for the Confederates, you used him for your next novel,
Right.
A Separate Country.
Right.
And kind of an interesting choice, especially being from Franklin. I know several rumors circulated that his picture used to hang over the urinal at the Carter House. I don't know if it's true.
I think that is true. I think that is true. You know, this is the thing. People love to hate Hood.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of misinformation. When I started writing A Separate Country, I didn't like Hood. I mean, he slaughtered his troops. He was a terrible general. I mean, I can go through it. As I got into primary sources, I couldn't find any of that. I couldn't find his troops hating him. I couldn't find that he was on laudanum. I couldn't find that he was confused or bitter or you know, he was mad when the Union Army got literally through his army the night before. But on and on, Hood not only appeared to have done a fairly decent job, and that's about what I can say. I think he's way over his head at Franklin, and I think he's one of the youngest company commanders. I think that he probably shouldn't have been in that position. But what I also found was that he was an amazingly decent person, and that did not play with any of the stuff that I've been told. You know, here he really was a good, decent guy. So yeah, and there's still people that'll come up to me and they'll say, I read the book, but I totally disagree. He's a terrible person, like as if they knew him.
Right. So he moved to New Orleans after the war.
He did.
11 kids?
Yeah, and you know, now remember the year before Franklin, in that July before, a year before, he's like doing this, trying to get his troops to move forward, and a bullet goes through his arm, and it cuts the tendons. It doesn't hit a bone, so it's a withered left arm. Then his right leg at the ball joint is removed at Chickamauga, and so he's missing more or less one arm and definitely one leg, and yet he moves to New Orleans and he marries, and in 11 years of marriage, they have 11 children. So much for handicaps. So anyway, he's it's kind of an amazing person. One of the amusing stories about Hood is that people who love to hate Hood love Mary Chestnut's description of his breakup with his fiancée, Sally Preston, who her friends called her Buck Preston. And they love that story. But what they don't seem to grasp is that Buck Preston was a miserable kind of, she's beautiful, there's no doubt about that, but a miserable person. And he ends up marrying not only a beautiful woman, Anna Marie Henning, but also a really decent, good woman. And that's so that's kind of interesting part that they like to leave out. You know, they love that breakup, but they don't really want to discuss the fact that he had this extraordinary marriage, and in 11 years not only had 11 children, but then a few months after the last one was born, his wife died, their oldest daughter died, and Hood died, leaving 10 orphans. Eventually that year, that youngest one died, and so left 9 orphans to grow up, scattered all across the United States. Many of them never saw each other again. Just one of the great tragic stories of the Civil War. And by the way, a story that both Northerners and Southerners were very attached to. There was no hatred of Hood in his time. That's kind of a 20th century thing.
Yeah, like you said, the death of Hood's wife and Hood himself and his children, that was very powerful. You felt all this pity for him after, he had been villainized so much here in Middle Tennessee, and just to see how he ended up. Of course, the book was fiction, but very similar. You did a lot of research on John Bell Hood, I could tell.
Well, I want to the reason that people hate Hood, and by the way, it's been embraced by Northern historians too. The reason is because it answers Franklin, and it says this is why Franklin failed, and that somehow it's Hood's personal. I mean, when I moved to Franklin, there were these descriptions of Hood and comparing him to Richard III. He was willing to kill his own people. He was a dastardly evil man, and the truth is that it was simply trying to say Franklin had no significance, because to really say, oh, Franklin. The South would have done it if they could have to Gettysburg and Antietam and Shiloh. They would have loved to have done it to all those places. They couldn't, but at Franklin they could. They could somehow grasp the story and say, yes, it really had no significance. Now,
You were the last casualty of the Battle of Franklin, are you not?
I am. You are exactly right. 8 stitches later.
Oh no!
I was sabering champagne, and I want to clarify this for the public. I did not cut myself on a saber. I was sabering champagne, bottles of champagne, as we were launching our newest campaign. It's a $2.8 million campaign to buy about 2.8 acres, right next to the Carter House, directly south of the Carter House. There's a floor shop and then a house that's being used as a commercial business, and I was sabering it, and then I laid it down. Someone else was supposed to be pouring it, nobody was, and so in just a moment of talking to someone, I grabbed the bottle of champagne, the throat of it, and my hand kind of slid up and cut off my thumb, or cut off enough of my thumb that I had to go to the hospital. So the stitches are out, and the thumb, I can't feel anything.
Oh no!
But it works. So,
oh, good. Well, I'm glad you're on the mend.
I am.
Any plans for any new books?
Yeah, I'm trying to finish this summer. Boy, that's a commitment. A third novel called The Book of Moriah. I love my title. I don't know if anyone else will love it, but it sounds biblical to me.
Yeah, it does.
And anyway, and it's about Moriah Reddick, who was a mixed-race woman who was at Franklin, and she's an extraordinary woman. I think in the first book, I say in the back of it that I find her really the most complete of all the people in the story, and I do. I find the real Moriah just an amazing person. She born into slavery, a white father, half African American, half Native American mother, and went through gigantic tragedies and suffering, and endured and survived, and that's it's less and less as I work on this book. it's less and less history and more fiction. But I hope it's an epic story about the triumph of the human will. That's at least my plan.
Good. I look forward to reading it. If people want more information on Robert Hicks, how can they find you online?
Well, they can go to www.robert-hicks.com, or they can find me on Facebook. I have a small presence in Facebook, and they can find me eating hot chicken somewhere. I don't know.
Thanks so much for coming.
Hey, man, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Keep reading and visit your local library.